The climate crisis is here. From wildfires to floods, doing nothing has serious consequences. Canada, with its large landscapes and fossil fuel industry, has decided to use a carbon tax as a main part of its climate plan. But what is the cost? This essay explores Canada's carbon tax, looking at its effect on everyday people and how well it addresses the climate emergency. The idea of a carbon tax is simple. Make polluters pay for the environmental damage they do. By putting a price on carbon emissions, businesses and people are encouraged to reduce their carbon footprint. Canada's carbon tax, started in 2019, puts a charge on fossil fuels like gasoline, natural gas, and coal. While the goal of the tax is to lower emissions, it also means higher costs for businesses and consumers. From increasing gas prices to higher heating bills, Canadians are feeling the impact of the carbon tax in their wallets. By looking at real government statistics and comparing Canada's approach to other countries, we will uncover the true weight this tax puts on average Canadians. Canada's carbon pricing system is complicated, including both a federal carbon tax and provincial carbon pricing systems. The federal tax, used in provinces that don't have their own approved systems, sets a minimum price on carbon emissions. This price goes up every year, reaching $170 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. The goal is to encourage a move away from fossil fuels by making them more expensive. However, how the carbon tax is put into place and its effects are very different across Canada's provinces and territories. Some provinces, like British Columbia, have had carbon taxes for a long time, while others, like Alberta, have strongly opposed federal involvement. The federal government says that the carbon tax is revenue neutral, meaning that the money collected is given back to Canadians through rebates and other programs. However, critics say that these rebates don't make up for the increased cost of everyday goods and services. While putting a price on carbon may seem like a simple solution, Canada's experience shows how complicated and potentially problematic this approach can be. The real cost of Canada's carbon tax is seen in the daily lives of Canadians. From filling up their gas tanks to heating their homes, people across the country are feeling the impact of this policy. According to Statistics Canada, the carbon tax added an average of 7.4 cents per litre to the price of gasoline in 2022. This might not seem like much, but for families and individuals already dealing with the increasing cost of living, it's a significant burden. The cost of heating homes with natural gas has also gone up, adding hundreds of dollars to yearly energy bills. These increasing energy costs have a ripple effect throughout the economy, making food, transportation, and other essential goods and services more expensive. While the federal government insists that the carbon tax is revenue neutral, many Canadians are doubtful. They argue that the rebates provided don't fully make up for the increased cost of living. Moreover, because the tax is regressive, it affects low-income households the most. These households often don't have the money to handle rising costs or make big changes to reduce their carbon footprint. Ignoring the struggles of everyday Canadians while pushing forward with a policy that is increasing the cost of living is not only unfair, but also risks eroding public trust in climate action. Canada is not the only country using carbon pricing. Many countries have adopted similar policies to try to curb emissions and fight climate change. In Europe, for example, the European Union Emissions Trading System, EU ETS, covers about 40% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. This cap-and-trade system sets a limit on total emissions from certain sectors, allowing companies to buy and sell emission allowances. The price of these allowances changes based on supply and demand, creating an economic incentive to reduce emissions. While the EU ETS has helped reduce emissions in some sectors, it has also been criticized for being complicated and unpredictable. Other countries, like Sweden, have chosen a carbon tax model similar to Canada's. Sweden's carbon tax, introduced in 1991, is one of the highest in the world, currently over $130 per ton of carbon dioxide. Comparing carbon pricing schemes across different countries is hard because of differences in policy design, economic situations, and environmental goals. Canada should learn from what other countries have experienced and carefully think about the potential costs and benefits of its chosen approach. The true cost of Canada's carbon tax goes far beyond the immediate impact on consumers. As the price of carbon goes up, it creates a ripple effect throughout the economy, affecting businesses, industries, and ultimately the overall cost of goods and services. One of the biggest concerns is the impact on energy-intensive industries. Canada is a major producer and exporter of oil and gas, and the carbon tax puts these industries at a disadvantage compared to others. As the cost of production increases, Canadian companies may have trouble competing in global markets, potentially leading to job losses and economic decline in regions that rely heavily on these industries. The manufacturing sector is also vulnerable to the increasing costs associated with the carbon tax. While the Canadian government has put measures in place to reduce the impact of the carbon tax on businesses, such as output-based pricing systems for large emitters, concerns remain about the long-term economic consequences. The government must carefully consider the potential trade-offs between environmental goals and economic competitiveness. While economic arguments against the carbon tax are often the focus, it's important to acknowledge the human cost of this policy. For many Canadians, especially those living in poverty or on fixed incomes, the carbon tax is not just an abstract policy debate. It's a daily struggle to afford basic necessities. The regressive nature of the carbon tax means that it disproportionately affects low-income households who spend a higher percentage of their income on essential goods and services like heating, transportation, and food. As the price of these essentials goes up, low-income families are forced to make difficult choices, often sacrificing other important needs like healthcare, education, or even food security. Rural and remote communities, often dependent on fossil fuels for transportation and heating because there are no affordable alternatives, are particularly vulnerable to rising energy costs. Indigenous communities, already facing systemic barriers and socio-economic disadvantages, are also disproportionately impacted by the tax. The human cost of the carbon tax is not just measured in dollars and cents, but in the stress, anxiety, and hardship it inflicts on individuals and families across Canada. The government must acknowledge and address these human costs, ensuring that policies designed to combat climate change do not unintentionally worsen existing inequalities or push vulnerable populations further into poverty. The basic idea of the carbon tax is that by making carbon emissions expensive, it will encourage businesses and individuals to reduce their environmental impact. However, whether this policy is effective in achieving meaningful emissions reductions is still being debated. While supporters point to some initial decreases in emissions, critics argue that the impact has been small at best and that the tax alone is not enough to meet Canada's climate targets. One of the main challenges is that the current price of carbon in Canada is considered too low to drive significant changes in behavior. While the price will increase gradually over time, many experts argue that a much higher price is needed to encourage the large-scale investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency needed to achieve substantial emissions reductions. Furthermore, the carbon tax alone cannot solve the complex and multifaceted challenge of climate change. Addressing this global crisis requires a comprehensive approach that includes investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transportation, and other sustainable infrastructure. While the carbon tax may be part of Canada's overall climate strategy, it's important to recognize its limitations and avoid exaggerating its potential impact. While the carbon tax has become a well-known policy response to climate change, it is not the only solution, nor is it necessarily the most effective or fair. As we have seen, the carbon tax, especially in its current form in Canada, has significant costs for consumers, businesses, and the economy as a whole. One alternative is a cap and dividend system. Similar to the cap and trade system, cap and dividend sets a limit on total emissions. But instead of allowing companies to buy and sell emission allowances, the government gives the revenue generated from the cap directly back to citizens as a dividend. This approach ensures that the benefits of emissions reductions are shared more fairly, particularly benefiting low-income households who often spend a larger portion of their income on energy. Another alternative is to focus on direct investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transportation, and other sustainable infrastructure. By making these investments, governments can create jobs, boost the economy, and reduce emissions without relying solely on a regressive tax. Addressing climate change requires a multifaceted approach that goes beyond simply putting a price on carbon. The climate crisis demands urgent action, but it's time to rethink how we approach this global challenge. While well-intentioned, Canada's carbon tax in its current form is not the answer. It places a disproportionate burden on those least able to afford it, risks hurting economic competitiveness, and may not be enough to achieve meaningful emissions reductions. We need a bolder, fairer, and ultimately more effective way forward. Instead of relying only on a regressive tax, we must prioritize investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transportation, and other sustainable infrastructure. We need to create a just transition for workers and communities currently dependent on the fossil fuel industry, ensuring that no one is left behind in the shift to a low-carbon economy. This requires a fundamental change in our economic system, one that prioritizes people and the planet over corporate profit. By embracing a more holistic and equitable approach, we can create a world that is not only environmentally sustainable, but also socially just and economically prosperous for all. The climate crisis is a defining challenge of our time, and it demands bold and decisive action. While Canada's carbon tax may seem like a step in the right direction, a closer look shows its limitations and unintended consequences. The high cost of the tax, its unfair nature, and its questionable effectiveness in reducing emissions raise serious concerns about whether it will work in the long term. It's time to move beyond the carbon tax and embrace a more comprehensive and equitable approach to climate action. This requires investing in renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transportation, and other sustainable infrastructure. It also means creating a fair transition for workers and communities currently dependent on the fossil fuel industry, ensuring that no one is left behind as we shift to a low-carbon economy. Ultimately, addressing the climate crisis requires a fundamental shift in our values and priorities. By embracing a more sustainable and equitable path, we can create a world where both people and the planet can thrive.